Welcome to the UW Now live stream. Tonight, we're discussing the great reset of fiscal policy under the Trump administration. Our panelists are experts in economics. Ananth Seshadri is the Mary Sue and Mike Shannon Distinguished Chair for Economics and the co-director of the Center for Research on the Wisconsin Economy, or CROW. Jessica Riedl is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research, a think tank focused on domestic policy and urban affairs, and a 1998 graduate of UW-Madison. Our conversation will be moderated by your host, Mike Knetter.
Well, thanks for joining us tonight. We have a great show on tap for you. The Great Reset of fiscal policy really revolves around a few things. Many things are undergoing a great reset in the early days of the Trump administration. Fiscal policy is no exception. Tariffs are now expected to be a much larger source of government revenue than they've been in the past. We're looking at the extension of tax cuts on income taxes, and DOGE is hard at work trying to find savings and reductions in government expenditures in a variety of areas. So there's a lot of action right now in fiscal policy, and I'm happy to say we've got two outstanding speakers tonight. Jessica Riedl has devoted much of her professional career to the study of American fiscal policy. She's a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and a 1998 graduate from the University of Wisconsin in economics and political science. Ananth Seshadri will kick us off tonight. He's the Mary Sue and Mike Shannon Chair in Economics, as you just saw, and he's an expert in public finance and macroeconomics. So without further ado, we're going to hear from Ananth first, and then we'll hear from Jessica. Thank you, Ananth.
Thanks, Mike. Good evening, everyone, and good evening to all the Badgers. I want to start off with basically some facts about manufacturing, move on to tariffs, relate trade deficits to budget deficits, and then get back to fiscal policy. So this is a graph that plots between 1990 and 2024, the decline in manufacturing value added relative to GDP. So way back in the past, agriculture used to be dominant in the economy. Then it switched to manufacturing. Then now we switch to services. And so you're seeing over the last 20 years or so a decline in the share of manufacturing in its contribution to GDP, not just in the United States, but also in China, in Japan, and in the UK. So this graph plots just the value added, the contribution of each of these countries in terms of just the volume of manufacturing. So what this shows is that in the early 2000s, the US used to be number one in terms of just the total amount of manufacturing measured in terms of dollars in real terms. China took over from the US, but the US still remains a manufacturing powerhouse. So here are a few facts that I thought it's good to kick us off with a few facts on manufacturing. We remain a manufacturing powerhouse. Employment in manufacturing has been experiencing a slow and secular downward trend. A big part of it that is due to automation. What do we import? We import intermediate inputs like capital goods, industrial supplies, raw materials, and often some of the intermediate inputs are used to produce exports. We consume a significant fraction of what we actually produce in terms of manufacturing. The global decline in manufacturing employment, which has particularly affected the Rust Belt, is primarily due to automation, right? So some of it's probably due to international trade, but a big portion of it is actually due to automation. There are some special cases for protectionism, and defense spending would be one of them, but those are rare. So here's a graph of trade deficits, which have received a lot of attention in the recent past. The red line shows net exports. So the last time our net exports were zero, which is to say that we're importing as much as we're exporting, was in 1975. So since 1975, our net exports have been negative, which is to say that we're bringing in more goods and services than we send to the rest of the world. Interestingly, we're net exporters of services, but we are net importers of manufacturing. So how about trade deficits, which have been the obsession of this administration? What is a trade deficit? Well, you have a trade deficit. We have a trade deficit when foreigners ship more goods and services to us than we do to them. Why does that happen? And what results as a consequence? In exchange, foreigners receive dollars. Everyone, it's the reserve currency. It's safe. It's secure. And in return for these goods and services, America is in the business of selling financial security. These dollars are reinvested back in the US. The US is still a powerhouse in technology, in biotech. And when foreigners buy American assets, buy American stocks and bonds, it lowers the cost of capital for American firms. A higher trade surplus does not necessarily correlate with higher growth. Another interesting fact is, even though the share of imports from China has grown significantly since 1990, the share of US imports from Asia hasn't grown very much. It used to be Japan that used to be the dominant country from whom we used to import, and now it's China. Trade deficits are neither inherently good or bad. It depends on what causes these trade deficits. And lastly, tariffs may or may not reduce the trade deficits, but will almost surely lower GDP and raise prices for consumers. So here I'm trying to relate the trade deficit and the budget deficits. The first equation you see up there is really national income accounting. Investment in any given country has to be equal to total savings. And savings come from three different constituents. So one is people like you and me, that's private savings. The government can save or dissave. The government's been running deficits. And foreigners can save in America, right? So the forces that determine investment are very different than the forces that determine saving. So America is worthy of investment because we're at the forefront of innovation. We are the forefront of technological change. And so the marginal product of capital is really high. The saving is really an issue about whether you want to move resources from today to tomorrow. Both public and private sectors contribute to the trade balance, but it turns out private savings actually exceeds private investment, but the government's been running a big deficit. And so if you stare at that equation in the middle, it tells you the connection between trade deficits and budget deficits. If investment was exactly equal to savings, then budget deficits and trade deficits would be exactly the same. Private savings in the US have been modest, while investment remains very strong because we're a technological leader, and so people want to invest in the US. But this gap between the savings and investments is made up by borrowing from the rest of the world, which results in a trade deficit. A different way of putting it is we want to save not very much, we want to consume a lot, but we also want to make sure investment happens in America, and trade deficits are a way of doing that. But the key is that government deficits here are one of the important reasons why we are running trade deficits. So here are the two deficits. So I've already mentioned the trade deficit, which is the dashed line. The budget deficit, or the federal deficits, the last time we ran surpluses were in the late 90s and early 2000s. And since then, we've pretty much been in deficit territory, which is to say that the government's been spending more than it brings in terms of revenue. So this, the red line up on top is federal spending. And notice that the federal spending since about 2000 or so has been systematically above the green line, which is revenue. So this all adds up and increases the debt to GDP ratio. Okay, so I'm not going to go over this in detail, but I just want to plot, because I know Jessica is going to cover this, but this tells you mandatory and discretionary spending. Look at the green line, which is one of the significant contributors of deficits, which is the amount of spending by the federal government on healthcare. And so that's went from basically zero in the 70s to about 6 to 7% of GDP right now. Interest payments on debt have been rising as interest rates have gone up in the last few years. So the red line shows you net interest payments as a fraction of GDP was very high in the 80s and 90s, was virtually zero. So we had a period in 2000s and in 2010s where real interest rates were basically zero. So we borrowed. We financed increases in consumption. And you'll see that interest payments on debt in the last 5 years have been systematically higher than each of their previous years. So this is interest spending on government debt as a fraction of GDP. 22 is higher than 21, 23 is higher than 22, and so on and so forth. And even this year, we're on pace to exceeding what it was in 2024. So here are 4 big challenges. So the first one is that we had a baby boom, and prior to the baby boom, which was between 46 and 64, we enacted a pay-as-you-go system. The US had one of the largest baby booms. The pay-as-you-go system effectively mandates that people who are working at a given point in time help support people who are retired. Subsequently, we had systematic and significant expansions of benefits, cost of living adjustments, disability coverages, which resulted in significant unfunded entitlements. So what's the challenge? The challenge is that politically, Social Security and Medicare are extremely popular with voters. Second, this is a graph that plots productivity growth, which you want to read from the scale on the right. And so the bars are really TFP growth, or total factor productivity growth. In the 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s, TFP growth or productivity growth exceeded 2% a year. Since then, we've had a productivity slowdown. Economists have debated the causes and consequences of it. And here I just plot, how it correlates with creative patents per capita. So it's possible that it's just the low-hanging fruit was easily invented, and now any additional innovation is just not very easy to accomplish. The third challenge, again, unique to the US, is healthcare spending as a percentage of GDP. So roughly speaking, in the 70s, we were on pace to be around the same level as Germany and France and Canada. Over the next 5 decades or so, we have grown secularly and systematically and way above our European counterparts. So our healthcare spending as a fraction of GDP is about 16, 17%, and the average in Europe is less than 10%. Finally, so what's the challenge associated with spending significant resources on payments to debt? One worry is that it crowds out investment. Investment is really going to lead to long-term economic growth. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that each percentage point increase in the debt to GDP ratio boosts the 10-year interest rates by 2 basis points. And as a consequence, you get higher interest rates, which raise the prices of borrowing, and you deter private investments. It also estimates, the CBO also estimates that for each dollar the federal deficit goes up, private investment actually falls by 33%. Marty Feldstein spent an entire career working on this, and he convincingly demonstrated there's a really complex relationship between inflation and the tax code, which resulted in reduced investment in the 70s and 80s. And so here's a graph that plots. The blue bar tells you how much we spent between 1971 and 2021 on average on research and development, infrastructure, and education. This is about 2.5% of GDP. In 2024, net interest payments on GDP were 3.1% and projected to rise going forward. So we spend more financing our debt than on productive uses for these federal dollars. So what about government waste? The Government Accountability Office says that the federal government loses between $233 billion and $521 billion annually to fraud, and that's a subcomponent of improper payments. Most Americans probably have a much more broader and expansive view of what waste is. So what has DOGE done? DOGE has found some instances, small instances, where money is spent in wildly counterproductive ways. So one example I can give is foreign aid, and foreign aid can often be ineffective and counterproductive. In many instances, including in Africa and sub-Saharan Africa, far from stimulating growth and reducing poverty, it served as a disincentive to economic and institutional reform. So DOGE announced about $105 billion in cost savings, but if you actually look at what the realized savings are, and those realized savings are small. It's possible it's going to take a whole lot of time for those to realize, but we're seeing nowhere near the claimed cuts of $150 billion. What I do like about DOGE is just they are attempting to shed light on government efficiency, and hopefully they can shed more light on government deficits. What is the issue? The issue is that nearly 3/4 of federal funding goes to either interest payments and debt or mandatory programs like Medicare and Social Security that really operate on autopilot. So what are the proposed measures to cut spending? Some of the proposed cuts for fiscal year 26 include cuts to non-defense discretionary spending by 22.6%, significant reduction in funding for education, funding for housing, public health, research, and many other agencies, and boost spending on defense by 13% and border security by 65%. In terms of tax cuts, the proposal is to extend the 2017 Tax Cut and Jobs Act from 2025 to 2036, cut the corporate tax rate from 21% down to 15%, eliminating federal taxes and Social Security benefits, exempting overtime pay. All of these are going to result in substantial increases in budget deficits. So can we actually achieve a 3% deficit to GDP ratio? So Treasury Secretary Bessent proposed reducing our deficit to GDP ratio, which is currently at 6.4%, to 3% by 2029, so end of President Trump's term. If you were to extend the tax cut and other provisions without any other corresponding cuts to spending, this is going to further increase our budget deficits. It will probably be in the 7 to 8% of GDP by 2029, according to my estimates. If you actually want to hit the 3%, it entails more than a 40% cut to everything else, which is, we're talking defense, homeland security, VA benefits, food stamps, welfare, etc. So this is just pretty much impossible if cuts to Social Security or Medicare are ruled out, which is really what President Trump has said. So here's, how do you actually work to cut deficits, especially in an era of high interest rates? This is important. There are only two ways to go, which is either you raise tax rates or taxes, to be more precise, or cut spending. Higher tax rates has the disadvantage that it could discourage work and investment. The other issue is that workers could dip into savings, thereby maintaining current consumption. Cuts to government benefits are likely to have an immediate impact on cutting consumption and likely to even cut imports. According to the CBO, benefit cuts are more effective in lowering the debt to GDP ratio, especially over the near term, than higher income tax rates. And the nice thing is that fiscal austerity generally extends over to trade. It spills over to trade and can actually have the benefit of reducing trade deficits. And this is going to be particularly effective if other countries are going to stimulate their economy. So think China, think Germany. If they're in the business of actually demanding more consumption and we cut our consumption, then a decline in the budget deficits can actually lead to a decline in trade deficits. I'm going to end with these last two slides. There's an important horse race, which is on the one hand, we want to grow our economy, and on the other hand, we want to make sure that interest rates are not that high, because especially when debt to GDP ratio is exceeding 100%. And so long-term interest rates are driven by savings, investments, demographics, productivity, and growth rate is driven by innovation, investments, incentives, and having robust competition. If growth slows down, which is what's been going on in the last 2 decades, or interest rates rise, which has been going on in the last 5 years or so, we need to cut spending. If not, the debt to GDP ratio is going to go up. And the US's primary deficit to GDP ratio is amongst the highest relative to the G7 countries. Okay, so finally, how could Trump make America greater? So the first step would be significant fiscal reform. I think it's important that there's bipartisan support. It's important that everyone recognizes that we need to tackle entitlements, perhaps even simultaneously engage in welfare reform. But reducing fiscal deficits in an era of lower growth and an era of higher interest rates is imperative. And it's hopefully we can get to it sooner than later. There are many plans that have been put forth, and hopefully we can get bipartisan support for this. The second is tax reform. I'm a fan of lower tax rates to generate more revenue. I hope it's broad-based with no special provisions, no special carve-outs. In terms of reducing barriers to movements of goods and services, we've been clamoring for immigration reform. I think President Trump did a great job of shutting down the border and essentially ensuring that we don't have illegal immigration in the form that we did. But let's try and get skilled immigration reform. Let's try and get seasonal workers in there. And in terms of tariffs, let's have targeted tariffs while encouraging trade, which really is going to grow GDP. We also want to ensure that a lot of the borrowing that we've been doing in the past is to finance consumption. I think it's important we borrow to finance productive investments and have a serious conversation of which of these are productive and not. I'll throw 2 of them out. Investments in R&D and early childhood education. There's a good amount of work by Jim Heckman at the University of Chicago suggesting you want to catch kids young and invest early in the life cycle. And finally, we want to be removing disincentives to work and save. I'll end right here and hand it over to Jessica. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ananth. That was a great tour de force of a lot of relevant information on this topic, and I can see a lot of great questions are rolling in. So we will kick it over to Jessica Riedl next, who has spent the bulk of her career studying American fiscal policy. So, Jessica, take it away.
Thank you so much, Mike, and thank you to everyone for coming out. Again, I'm class of 98, econ poli-sci, freshman year in Og Hall, rest in peace. It's the old Og Hall's gone. I work for the Manhattan Institute, but I actually live right outside of Washington, D.C. in Oakton, Virginia. But still a Badger. Got my Wisconsin econ shirt, or hat. So let's take a look at the fiscal picture. The budget deficit under current law, which is to say if the tax cuts are not extended, all the discretionary spending caps are actually listened to, and Congress enacts nothing, shows a budget deficit of about 1.8 trillion currently, growing to about $2.6 trillion over the rest of the decade. Still not as high as it was during the pandemic, where you see the 3 trillions, but a lot higher than it was shortly after the pandemic, heading to 2.6 trillion. The real danger is when you look at the current policy baseline. The difference is the current policy baseline doesn't assume that laws expire. It assumes that we keep the current tax cuts in place. So the Trump tax cuts are fully extended. It also assumes that we don't actually enact some pretty sharp cuts to discretionary spending that are required under current law, but that we know Congress probably won't do. So if you assume Congress is going to keep acting like it does, the deficit doubles from $1.8 trillion to $3.6 trillion. Again, that's just to keep current policies in place. That's before we've added new stuff. Pretty scary. One thing that I want to focus on in these projections is the interest costs. As you can see, as late as 2021, interest costs were about $350 billion. This year, they're going to be nearly $1 trillion. And the real danger is over the next decade, interest costs are going to jump to $2 trillion a year. And even that assumes low interest rates. What that means is that by the end of the decade, about 30% of your income, or 30% of all your federal taxes will just go to paying interest on the debt. Ultimately, that means pretty much all the taxes you pay from New Year's until the end of April will just pay interest. Over time, you see how interest is going to become a much bigger share of the budget. This chart is spending as a share of GDP over time. The red line is interest. You can see that in 2023, interest surpassed Medicaid. Last year, interest surpassed defense, and this year, interest will surpass Medicare to become the second biggest item in the federal budget, second only to Social Security. And it's coming at Social Security. Even under this low interest rate scenario, within 17 years, interest surpasses Social Security to become the biggest item in the budget. By that point, 3 decades from now, about 60% of all federal taxes will just go to paying interest on the debt. So you won't be working and paying taxes for your benefits, your national security, and your infrastructure until August. And here's where it gets a little even scarier. So this is the historical interest rate on the federal debt. The red line is the nominal interest rate, and the blue line is the inflation adjusted rate. Now, you can see from the red line that since 1981 and really over the last several decades, the interest rate on the federal debt has fallen. It actually bottomed out at about 1.5%. But that's not normal. and interest rates have started rising again. The thing that worries me as an economist is that this is the Congressional Budget Office's projection through 2054. They assume that the interest rate on the debt will never exceed 3.8% over the next 30 years. That no matter how big the debt grows, and as Ananth said in his presentation, higher debt raises interest rates by itself by soaking up the savings and leaving less savings available for home loans, car loans, and business loans. You would think interest rates might rise back to pretty healthy high numbers. Instead, they assume only 3.8. By the way, the 10-year bond right now, today, is trading at 4.8. So we're already above that. What does that mean? A minute ago, I showed you that chart showing that the current policy baseline shows a deficit going to $3.6 trillion over the decade. Well, what happens if interest rates are 4.5% instead of 3.5%? Now you're looking at a deficit of $4.2 trillion, which is about, based on interest rates right now, you're looking at a $4.2 trillion deficit just to continue the policies we have today. That is, and this assumes no wars, no recessions, and no big expansions that Congress likes to do regularly. We could be looking at deficits well into the $4 trillion of dollars. What economists are most focused on is the debt as a share of GDP. Think of it like your mortgage as a share of your income. How much do we owe as a percentage of our income? The Congressional Budget Office says that, first as background, the debt was 106% of GDP at the end of World War II. After World War II, it averaged only about 40% of GDP. We actually had the debt as a share of GDP fall to about 40%. Since 2008, it's leaped from 40% to 100%. And the Congressional Budget Office, in their baseline, says it's going to go to about 166 over 30 years. But that's the current law baseline. If you assume the tax cuts will be extended, and they will, the debt goes to 203%. If you assume that Congress is not going to follow the discretionary spending caps, it goes to 241%. If interest rates rise up into the fours like they're looking now, well, now you're looking at a debt of 300% of the economy in 30 years. When a debt is that big, you're exceeding anything we have seen in any developed economy. Japan is the biggest right now. They're about 230% of GDP, and their economy has been a basket case for 30 years, even though they have a high savings rate to finance it. We have a low savings rate. We're going even higher. So if the debt goes to 300% of GDP at a 5% interest rate, that means the interest is 15% of GDP. Totally unsustainable. So what's driving this debt? What we see here is the federal budget projected through 2054. And the black line in the middle is revenues. Notice that black line basically gets buried. What's pushing up spending is not as much the yellow. Defense spending is actually dropping. Non-defense discretionary is steady at about 3% of GDP. Look at the red. Social Security and Medicare is going to go to 14.3% of GDP, even though the programs only take in a couple percent of GDP in revenues through payroll taxes, premiums. This also includes Social Security, which is also going to have the same big deficit problems because of the baby boomers. Overall, here's a scary number. Over the next 30 years, Social Security and Medicare will run a cash shortfall of $124 trillion. So no, Social Security and Medicare are not paying for themselves. They're going to run a $124 trillion shortfall. And then the interest blows up. The interest is what's going to also be what buries us. If this sounds a little hyperbolic, the economists at Penn Wharton recently tried to model out the long-term economy under these current debt projections. They couldn't. They wrote that our economic models effectively crash when trying to project future macroeconomic variables under current policy. The reason is that current fiscal policy is not sustainable, and forward-looking financial markets know it. That's pretty scary stuff. So with where we are now, we always hear that we can cut taxes, but we can still balance the budget. In order to do that, you would have to get rid of a third of the government. If you were to also take Social Security and Medicare off the table, well, now you got to get rid of 65% of everything else. If we're also going to take veterans off the table, now it's 76% of everything else has to be eliminated. And if you say no cuts to Social Security, Medicare, veterans, or defense, which most politicians do, well, now it's mathematically impossible to balance the budget. You could get rid of everything else, wouldn't be enough. Again, in terms of what's driving the spending, you hear a lot about immigrants, Ukraine, foreign aid. If people want to get rid of that spending, that is a fine debate to have, but ultimately that's not where the money is going. Immigration is projected to add about 0.2 billion to spending over the decade. Ukraine 0.3 trillion, foreign aid 0.5 trillion. Defense 10 trillion, Medicare 13 trillion, interest 14 trillion, Social Security 20 trillion. If you want to rein in spending, you got to go where the red ones are. That's where the money is. So some final thoughts. And by the way, in the Q&A, I am happy to go into Doge, which I had an article in The Atlantic on last week. I'm happy to go into economic growth projections and what's the economic growth outlook? Can we grow our way out of this? I'm happy to go into that. But let me just say to conclude, deficits are heading towards $4 trillion within a decade due to Social Security, Medicare, interest, and tax cuts. The national debt is going to go from 30 trillion to $200 trillion just to maintain current government services, driven by Social Security and Medicare shortfalls of 124 trillion. The danger is this debt is going to strain the financial markets, which is going to push up interest rates more and create a vicious circle of debt and growth. We want to grow our way out of this, but economic growth is already going to face real constraints due to stagnant labor force growth. And I work with Congress every day out here in Washington. They know all of this. I brief them on this. I work with them on this. They know all of this. They're not going to do anything about it anytime soon because they're addicted to the politics of Santa Claus. They are there to cut taxes, hike spending, and hope that they're not around when the bill comes. On that happy thought, I'm happy to hand it back to Mike.
Well, I often end the show. I'll just tell you both right now, I'm going to ask you to say something optimistic at the end of the program. I'll give you time to think about that because right now I'm a little pessimistic, but I really appreciate just the sheer volume of facts that you both brought to the table tonight on myriad important issues. We have a lot of great questions that have come in, and I'm going to start to pick my way through them. And I'm going to start out, the question came in early on from Chuck Weiss, and I thought it was really a fair comment, which there was some mention of certain federal programs are mandatory and others are discretionary. Ananth, could you just explain what you mean by that? Is it mandatory things are kind of on autopilot?
Yeah, so mandatory programs like Social Security or Medicare, these are essentially programs that are on autopilot in terms of spending because there are existing laws in place that don't require you to go through appropriations come fall, right? Whereas the discretionary part of the spending, which is R&D, infrastructure, education, is called discretionary spending because that goes through the appropriation process.
Thank you. So something might be mandatory, but we could potentially tackle that, but we'd have to change the formula for the autopilot. And obviously what I heard both of you saying is if we refuse to do that, there is no hope of getting this budget back in line. Alice Strange sent a question in, and I think this is an important point to follow up on for our audience. How can lower tax rates generate more tax income? That was, somewhat mysterious to her. And
yeah, I mean, so the kind of thing, for instance, I have in mind is if you, for instance, look at the top 1% of Americans in terms of earning, they earn roughly, I think, 20% of all the income, but they pay 40% of all the taxes. And so it depends on which side of the Laffer curve, let's say the top 1% is. That's a debatable proposition. You can try raising tax rates on the rich or on the wealthy, but there will be mechanisms through which they either try to avoid it or try to have other sources of income. And so it's honestly anyone's guess at this stage as to what will happen when you kind of lower tax rates. But I think this should be, I want to back up and also say, we certainly don't want to be adding to deficits, right? So it's important when we cut tax rates that we follow the CBO projections and don't end up adding to deficits, or we increase spending on one particular program and we don't add to deficits. But yeah, there have been instances where tax rates have gone up and tax collections have gone up or gone down. And so again, it depends on which side of the Laffer curve you are.
So there's been a fair bit of commentary lately in the media about the possibility that the U.S. could lose its reserve currency status, and that's particularly come up after we picked the trade war with all the other countries of the world at the same time. A lot of people began to worry, well, what if people start to turn against the U.S., try to avoid using the dollar as a vehicle currency? And of course, we saw maybe a bit of an acceleration of that trend when we decided to kind of shut Russia out of the global trading system a few years ago. Whether right or wrong, of course, other countries begin to wonder, well, how much can we trust the US dollar, and should we be already thinking about other mechanisms? But what would happen to our interest payments or deficits if we were to lose our reserve currency status? Any sense of that, Jessica?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'll let Ananth hands.
Yeah, so this
his
is
wheelhouse.
There's a fair bit of research on what is the value to the exorbitant premium, as I think it was a former French finance minister who coined that term in the mid 1960s. How much of an exorbitant premium do we get just because we're the reserve currency? I would say the estimates are holding fixed the level of debt. So obviously, if you're going to borrow way more, if you're going to go in the territory of 200% of GDP, the interest rates are going to be even higher. But if you hold fixed the level of debt, we probably have an interest rate of between half a basis point to a basis point. So about a percentage point decline in the interest rate, or 0.5% decline in interest rates as a consequence of our exorbitant privilege that we have. So which is pretty significant when you think about a debt that's really 30 trillion or a little higher kind of going forward.
Yeah, so it could easily be 12 to 25% higher interest payments if we weren't the reserve currency.
Right.
And the interest payments are themselves a pretty big chunk of this. So, okay. Carlos wonders, why don't we just increase the taxes on corporations and the ultra rich to help peck away at this problem? Jessica.
Ultimately, we're going to need, I believe having built some 30-year plans to fix the budget, first off, you have to put everything on the table. You can't you can't just tax the rich. You can't just cut defense. You got to put everything on the table. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, defense, taxing the rich, and yes, taxing the middle class all have to contribute, because the deficit's too big to do otherwise. In terms of taxing the rich, it's important to note that even if you seized every penny of wealth from every billionaire, all of their assets, it would fund the government one time for 8 months, and then it would be gone, as would your 401k, because a lot of that money is in the market. Even 100% tax rates wouldn't come close to closing deficits. I did a report 2 years ago called The Limits of Taxing the Rich, where I set every corporate and upper income tax at its revenue maximizing rate without regard to economic impact. Forget, no matter how destructive it is, I'm going to create a tax code that's going to maximize the revenue maximizing rate and get rid of the deductions for every tax the rich policy. It raised about 1% of GDP. Out of a deficit that's right now 5% of GDP going to 14. So I do think everybody's going to have to contribute, including the rich. But there are limits to how high you can raise taxes on anybody before you start to lose revenue. And so while, again, I think it should be a part of the solution, you're not going to get that much money out of it. You're going to have to raise taxes on the middle class, and you're going to have to get most of your savings from Social Security and Medicare, which horrifies a lot of people. But this is just the math.
Can I also add something real quick to that in the corporate tax zone? And so it's interesting because if the corporate tax rate is uncompetitive, then we're going to basically be losing businesses who are going to set shop elsewhere. In fact, one of the targets of the Trump administration is to ensure that people locate back in the US. A more direct way to ensure that businesses choose not to go to Ireland, let's say, and then we import a whole bunch of pharmaceuticals from Ireland, would be to actually have a lower corporate income tax rate so that Pfizer and these others and multinational corporations have an incentive to set shop in the United States. So a corporate tax reduction can have a direct effect in terms of making sure the business is located in America as opposed to going about it through a tariff.
Steve Goldstein asks, could there be such thing as too much foreign investment in the United States where we might lose control of our productive assets? And I know, Ananth, we've talked about this not only tonight, but on previous shows, that really the mirror image of the trade deficit is net foreign investment in the United States. And that's part of what's enabled our tech industry and others to be financed and grow the way they have, in spite of the big deficits. But could there be too much foreign investment in the United States? And at what point would you be worried?
I mean, at some level, the way I would put the too much, or why I would be worried, is we're undertaking a significant debt burden, mainly to finance consumption, right? A part of it is to finance investment, but a big chunk of it is to finance consumption. And so the worry would be that it's not a question of investment being too much investment, because these are firms that are basically can decide that they don't want the investment, right? So no one's basically forcing others to buy our equity. Firms have a choice as to whether to sell the equity to foreigners. But the bigger concern I would have is just overdependence of consumption on debt would be the concern that I have.
So let's just assume, and I think this is a fair assumption, that politicians are in fact aware of this, and they've been aware of it for a long time, and we haven't done anything. So I guess I would assume they will be looking for the next way to kick this can down the road. What are the next tricks that we're going to see the political engine use to kind of paper over this? Is there a way? Are there some easy fixes, Jessica, that you've looked at, or when we start selling off, could we sell Alaska, and buy Greenland? I'm not sure. I mean, a lot of things are on the table these days.
One Well, first off, in terms of what tricks are they using right now, the tricks Congress is using is to pretend it doesn't cost anything. The Ways and Means Committee just released a tax bill that's going to cost $5.3 trillion over the decade, plus $900 billion in interest costs, for a total of $6.2 trillion over the decade. But the trick they're using is, because it's extending current tax cuts, most of it is, or going beyond that, they're just going to assume the cost is zero. They're just going to write in zero cost. In terms of, is there an easy way to kick the can? My fear is that there isn't. Yes, there's asset sales. There's, the federal government owns a lot of land out west that we can sell. But ultimately, there aren't enough buyers to make that big of a difference in the debt. And the broad worry I have about the deficit, and I wrote a cover story in Reason on this last year, is that whenever you tell people how bad it is, people default to their one cool trick. Oh, no. All we got to do is cut defense. All we got to do is Medicare for all. If you just get rid of the immigrants and the foreigners, everyone kind of goes to their corner of, if you just do this, the problem is solved. Or on Social Security, if you just get rid of the cap and apply the payroll tax all the way up, nope, it's not even close to being enough. The problem with one cool trick is none of them by themselves come within miles of fixing the problem. Some of them would reduce the deficit somewhat. Some of them should be part of a broad solution, but by themselves, there is no one cool trick. There is no easy answer. There is no brilliant idea out there. There is no, if you just do this one partisan thing I like, none of them are enough. It's too big.
So we're getting a little skepticism from some of our viewers about Doge, and I guess people interpreted some of the comments made tonight as, well, maybe Doge, could do a few things. And in fairness, I mean, I guess having worked in government a bit myself, in the policy apparatus, I guess I left Washington thinking, bureaucracies can get kind of big and kind of complacent, and usually when you want to look at a really well-run enterprise, nobody holds up a natural monopoly as a shining example of that. So I would say that, every once in a while, it's probably a good thing to really pick up all the rocks and look under them and see what you can find. But could you both talk briefly about, what do you think Doge could really produce? And I know, Jessica, you wrote something about this recently in the Atlantic, so maybe we'll start with you and then Ananth, tell us.
If anyone wants to Google just Jessica Riedl Atlantic Doge, I had an article in the Atlantic last week investigating how much has Doge really saved. And the answer, and let me set it up by saying, I love the idea of Doge. I love the idea of getting rid of government waste. I'm a fiscal conservative. I've spent the last 25 years building blueprints to cut waste. Unfortunately, I don't think Doge is doing a very good job. I don't think that they know what they're doing. I don't think these people really understand much about the government. They don't have much experience. They don't know what they're doing. And I would like to see Doge go after $191 billion lost every year to payment errors. GAO put out reports on duplication, waste, and fraud costing a couple $100 billion a year too. There is waste. The problem is Doge is just going after the symbolic stuff. DEI contracts, Politico subscriptions, foreign aid, government employees. These are culture war totems that really excite a lot of Republican voters, but save almost no money. And that's why, although Doge claims to have saved $165 billion, my Atlantic article actually went through the government spending databases and calculated that they've actually only saved about $2 billion a month so far, not $165 billion, because they're going for the easy headlines instead of doing the real work of cutting waste. So I see Doge as a really upsetting missed opportunity.
Ananth,
Yeah,
any thoughts about
I agree
those?
with that, Mike. And I think I had some of this in my slides as well, where I kind of like the idea of have at it, just see how much waste and fraud there is. I do think that it's going to be a few months or a few years before the full impact of these cuts are going to be realized. For instance, Biden on his way out gave federal employees a 2% raise. There have been buyouts, for instance, to the folks who've been let go. And all those are showing up as payments right now. So when Jessica looks at the data with a fine-tooth comb, you're not going to see the savings, and it's going to take a few months to kind of see those savings. All of that said, I wish they would focus more appropriately on what the GAO has already identified. I hope they would shed light on the fiscal deficit. So to me, the bigger issue is just the fact that Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security are all in the process of becoming insolvent starting in 2035, 2033. Politically, there isn't any appetite to tackle that. That is the big problem of our times. Can we showcase that? And can we make sure the Democrats and Republicans end up at a compromise with both tax increases and spending cuts? So to me, that would be incredibly productive to shine the light on all of the wonderful graphs that Jessica had and ensure that the public is more educated than they are currently.
Susan Fancher wonders, with the reductions in employment at the IRS, are we missing a great opportunity? So if the IRS was on point, Jessica, how much could that produce for us? What are we losing out on by lax enforcement at the IRS?
Yeah, the Doge, according to the Inspector General at Treasury, the first round of Doge cuts is going to wipe out 31% of the employees who do tax enforcement at the IRS. This is an IRS that's already cut its audits in half of rich people over the last 15 years. And it's also reduced customer service. 80% of all calls to the IRS go unanswered. Their paper backlog is 31 million items. And my favorite IRS factoid, when you mail a tax return instead of e-filing it, they have to manually enter your tax return into a computer. They actually have someone manually entering all the numbers in your tax return. But what they're doing by getting rid of this staff is they're going to save a few $1 billion in IRS employees. They're going to lose hundreds of billions of dollars over the decade in increased tax evasion. Every dollar of tax enforcement spending brings $5 to $9 in extra revenues. My concern is people will say to me, I thought you were a fiscal conservative. Why do you want to fund the IRS? And it's because, look, taxes eventually are going to have to be raised. They just are. The deficit's too big. They're going to have to both cut spending and raise taxes. But we have a tax gap of $625 billion a year in unpaid taxes. The bigger the tax gap is, the more they're going to have to raise middle-class taxes to meet the revenue target. I would rather go after the tax cheats first so we don't have to raise my taxes and your taxes as much.
The following question, you're only allowed a one-word answer. Greg Schenke wonders, from what I am hearing, the only solution to deal with the debt involves a combination of lower spending and increased tax. True or false?
True.
True. I agree. The moderator could answer that one. All right. Jason Benedict, spending as a percentage GDP showed that we're spending 5 to 6% more than other developed countries. First of all, I want to make sure you agree with that statement. And then secondly, if true, does this imply having a mature universal health insurance system would save money?
I can take it, but why don't you go first, and then I'll follow up.
No, so I think the deficit is 6.4% of GDP. I don't know if spending as a fraction of GDP is 6% higher than other countries. So that I'm not sure.
I don't think that's true.
Yeah.
It's on healthcare. Yeah, I think he's making a healthcare point that we spend 6% of GDP more on healthcare than other countries. Doesn't that suggest that we should adopt more of a universal system?
And thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I'll just say the danger is I don't think we can adopt their system because we have a different health infrastructure than they do. You see, the countries that nationalized healthcare nationalized it 50, 60, 70 years ago when there was a really small health infrastructure, and then they contained its growth over 50 years. What we did is we created a big infrastructure. We have big, roomy hospitals. We have more technology. We have higher salaries for doctors. We have higher prescription drug investment costs. We can't just cut payment rates to European levels for bigger hospitals, more technology. The infrastructure is too big. It's kind of like saying Europe pays, housing is cheaper in Europe, so we should pay European mortgages for the bigger American houses. Now, you can say that Europe did it the right way, that we should have constrained the growth of health infrastructure. But with the infrastructure we have today, if we tried to cut payment rates drastically, too drastically, the hospitals and the physicians would not be able to provide care anymore because the infrastructure is so much higher. And so I do think, it's one thing to create a small health economy and grow it limited. It's another thing to build a sprawling health economy and then not pay for it. So I don't think we can do it.
All right. Well, we are coming up on the top of the hour. I want to say this has been one of the most informed programs we've had. We have a great topic and we had the perfect people to address it. So I just want to thank you both. And I'll just wrap up by highlighting a few of the things that I think I learned tonight. First and foremost, the decline of manufacturing in the United States and trade deficits in the United States are really a distraction to what the real problem is that the country faces. The declining share of manufacturing is pervasive across countries, and it's related to automation, and we saw that in the charts tonight. And it sort of mirrors what happened with the share of employment and output in agriculture a century ago. We've progressed to a different type of economy. The trade deficits that we have are a product of saving and consumption decisions. Foreign investment in the United States, which is the mirror image of our trade deficit, has really been a major vote of confidence in the long-term health of U.S. firms and in the stability of the U.S. dollar. Our budget deficits, however, are a big part of what's driving our trade deficits, and we saw that from the simple equation of how investment in the United States needs to be financed either by personal private saving, government saving, or foreign saving. And with huge budget deficits, that crowds out private investment directly. So the US budget deficits and debt are now crowding out investment ever more. And this accelerates as interest rates increase and as spending continues to outstrip the growth in tax revenues. So it certainly looks like we're on an unsustainable path. I hope that will be a major subject of conversation as we shift our focus to fiscal policy in America. It remains to be seen. I don't know what trick is left up the sleeves of politicians to kick that can further down the road, but I think it's gone about as far as it can. And I expect we're going to confront a reality soon enough. So I wish I had cheerier news. I promised that I would have our guests offer a word of optimism at the end of the show. I forgot about that. Maybe I let them off the hook, so I'm not sure they were going to get there. But anyway, there's still time. And obviously there's a lot of great assets in this country and a lot of really productive people. So hopefully we'll find our way out of this. But it's a serious problem and deserves our attention. So thanks for joining us tonight. Look forward to seeing you again next month when I'm sure we'll have another interesting program because there is certainly a lot to talk about these days. Thank you. And on Wisconsin.